Familiar with applying stylings to classes and IDs, we're going to apply those styles to a group of HTML elements, and the usual way to do that is to split them up inside divs. So div is just short for division, and let's say for some reason I wanted to take those first two paragraph tags and split them into a separate div to the rest. I'll try and get my indenting nice. There we go. For now, I'm going to take away my classes for those as well. So you can see in itself the div doesn't do anything. It doesn't apply any classes or make it look any different. But if I apply a class to that div, I might want to give it a class of first section. And notice I've used a dash there, not a space. You should never use spaces in your class or ID names. And in fact, I think I'll make that an ID because there's only going to be one first section. So it makes more sense to give it an ID rather than a class. So then I might want all the text in that first section to be blue. So can you apply that for me? Make all the text in the first section div blue with just a single CSS command. Go for it. All right, hope you managed it. It's an ID, so we're going to use hash and then first section. Then we add in our curly brackets, and then if we want everything to be blue, we just use color colon blue. There we go, and then that will style everything inside the first section div as blue. So that's one way of using divs to style the contents, but we can also apply the style to the div itself. So let's say we wanted a pink background for some reason in this first section. Then we could set the background color to pink. There we go. And then you can see now we've got a really separate section to the rest of the page. And you can also then see the limits of what the div is. So the div is that box, which goes all the way across the page and contains those two paragraphs. We might want to also change the width of this div. So rather than go all the way across the page, we might want to go halfway across the page. And we do that just using width and 50%. That would take it halfway across the page. There we go. We could also set the width to a certain number of pixels. So if we made it 100 pixels, for example, px, then that would mean that the text would start to go on to multiple lines. And that's more or less all there is to it. We can use divs to apply styles to the contents of the div, but also to the div itself, like this background color. So very quick challenge for you. Can you put a div around the third paragraph tag and the H1 and then give them both a yellow background? Go for it. All right, hope that went well. It should have just been something like div, and then you could have done it with a class or an ID. I'm going to give it an ID of second section. That seems to make sense. And then I'll close my div after the H1. And I hope you did your indenting all nicely. And that's all we need in terms of HTML. So to apply the background, we just use the hash and then second section to select that div. And then we want a background color of yellow. There we go. So we're still a fairly long way from beautiful websites, but we're coming on quickly in our ability to apply a range of styles to different objects in groups and with classes and IDs. So I hope this is all making sense so far. We're now going to look at specific stylings, how you achieve certain effects, and we're going to start in the next video looking in more detail at color. Now that we've learned how to apply CSS to different portions of our HTML, we're going to, in the next few videos, look in more detail at specific CSS styles. And we'll start with one that we've looked at already, and that is color. So we've already looked at two different ways of changing the color of your document. So the first is applying the color of the text. And for that, we just use color and then whatever color we want. The other one we've seen is changing the background color of an object, and that's pretty easy as well. Background-color and then whatever color you want. Of course, though, not all colors have names. You might want to be a little bit more precise about the color that you want rather than just allowing the browser to decide what sort of blue you want. And there's a much more accurate way you can use to get perfect colors, and that is using HTML color codes. So have a quick Google, HTML color codes, and that will take you to most likely htmlcolorcodes.info or a similar site. So I'm going to use this nice diagram here, and then we can click on any of those squares to get a particular color code for that color. So let's say I want to use that particular shade of green, I think I'd say it is. Then this here is what's known as its alphanumeric, because it's got letters and numbers in it, color code. So if I want to use that instead of a name for the color, all I do is I replace the name, so pink, with the code. And notice that we need to have a hash symbol before the code, and my text editor here even knows what color that is, which is nice. So then if we go back and have a look at our page, that background has changed to that nice light green. So that's more or less all there is to it. Just to show you, on htmlcolorcodes.info, you can also use a color picker, which allows you to be a lot more accurate, and you can choose a whole range of different colors and shades, and it will give you the color code for that. So let's say we want a sort of lightish blue here, then we can just copy that, Command C or Control C, and then I can make that the background for my second section. Of course, I do need to put the hash at the beginning. And there we go. One final thing before we move on. You'll notice this little eyedropper that's appeared up there. Chrome plugin called ColorZilla. There's lots of similar plugins that do the same thing, but this is the one that I use. It works and it's really simple. And what that allows you to do is essentially steal any color from any website or app that you want to use in your page. So say, for example, I really liked the color in Google's logo on that G there, and I wanted to use that particular color in my website somewhere. I would take my eyedropper, having installed ColorZilla or something similar, and then pick color from page. And then you can see what's happening here is as I move my cursor around, it's picking up the colors underneath it and giving me the code for it. So if I go over that G there, you can see it's got that nice blue color. So if I click, it's now copied that color to the clipboard. So if I then changed my blue here from the default blue to that particular color code, then I now get a much nicer, sort of softer blue than I had before. So that's a nice cheeky way. If you see on the web a color that you like the look of, then use ColorZilla to steal it and apply it in your own web pages. Great, so that's how we use any color that we want in our websites. In the next video, we'll look at the arrangement of our HTML elements using floating. All right, so now we've looked at adding whatever colors we want to our CSS. We're going to change direction a little and look at positioning. Now, so far, you probably will have noticed that every paragraph tag and every div just appears directly below the previous one. Quite often that might be what you want, but perhaps we want this green box here to appear on the right and the left box to appear over here on the left where the green box currently is. How would we achieve that? Well, we do it using floats, and it's actually pretty simple. So first off, I'm just going to change the width of our two divs Oh, I've lost my color somehow there. There we go. Just so that one's a little wider and this one is a little narrower. So I'll make them both 200 pixels so we can see more clearly where they've been moved to. So first off, let's say we want this green box to appear on the right over here. Let's give it a go. All we do is we take our first section and add in the styles float right. There we go. And let's take a look, see what effect that has. There we go. So that floats the green box to the right there. And you can see that if we expand the page, it floats all the way to the right of the page, however wide it is. Now what happens if we float it to the left? Let's take a look. We're now more or less back where we started, but without this default margin that we had in place. So there's now no gap between the two blocks. So what if I wanted the green box to be to the left of the blue box? Well, all I'd do there is float the blue box left as well. And there we go. So you can see the floats come one after the other, but everything that's floated left will be aligned to the left of the screen. Similarly, if we took the second section now and floated it right, what impact do you think that would have? All right, hope you got it. It will simply align it to the right of the screen. So hopefully that's reasonably straightforward. We've got floating to the left and floating to the right. What happens, you might be wondering, if we combine elements that are floated with elements that aren't floated? Let's find out. So if we add a paragraph tag, this paragraph is not floated. So have a quick guess, where do you think it's going to end up? Let's find out. In the middle, bizarrely enough. So anything that's not floated is just going to put itself in the flow of the page. So if we have a look, if we bring this in, it will try and squeeze itself into the gap, and if it can't, it will put itself underneath the other floated element. So this is actually a nice way to have, say, a left menu and a right menu or something like that, and then some content in between. But what if we wanted our paragraph to appear underneath both of these boxes? Well, there's a fairly easy way to do that as well, and I'll show you what it is. We actually introduce a new div after the divs that have been floated, and we're going to give this a special style. So I'll give it a class of, and I'll call it clear float. And what this div is going to do is effectively clear all of the floats so that anything after appears below anything that's been floated up here. And the CSS that we want for that is dot clear float to select that particular div, and then we use clear, and then you can see we've got the option here. We can clear all the left floats if we want, or the right floats, but normally we want to clear both left and right floats. So if we do that, the paragraph now appears beneath both of these floated divs. And that's about it. So to summarize, if you float something to the left, it will appear to the left of any non-floated content. If you float something to the right, it will appear to the right of any non-floated content. And if you want something to appear underneath all of your floated elements, then you use clear both on a special div to achieve that. Now we'll be looking at floating in a lot more detail later on in the project at the end of this section, where we'll be recreating the BBC News website. That's as far as we'll go for now. Feel free to have a little play around and see how floating behaves. We have lots of floating elements interacting with each other, but we're now going to our investigation of how we can position our elements wherever we want them on the page. We're going to move away from floating and look at positioning. So floating has the advantage of being pretty flexible. it will float to the edge of the page however wide the user's screen is, which can often be very useful. Sometimes though you need a bit more precision and you want to know exactly where your elements are, and that's where positioning comes in. So first off, I'm going to get rid of all our floating so that we know where everything is to start with. So we don't need our clear float div anymore. And let's just check that that brings us back to where we were before. Wonderful. So maybe I want to take this green box and move it a little bit to the right. I don't want it quite left of the page. For some reason, I want to indent it a little bit. So there are several ways to do that, but we're going to do that now with positioning. So remember, the first box is our first section here. So first off, we tell the browser that we're going to be positioning this div. And we do that by setting the position to relative. Relative positioning means that we're going to be positioning it relative to where it would otherwise be. So at the moment, if we just take a look at that, that doesn't change anything at all because it is where it was, if you know what I mean. But if we wanted to move it relative to where it currently is, we would then add something like left and then say 200 pixels. And let's have a look and see what effect that has. So that now moves it 200 pixels in the horizontal direction. You might be slightly surprised that we've said left 200 and it's actually moved it to the right, but you could think of it as having almost a 200 pixel margin on the left there, and that's why it's moved to the right. If we wanted to move it to the left, we just do the same thing, but with a negative number of pixels. So let's try moving it to the left, fix 50 pixels. And there you go. You can see we've even moved it off the screen, and we can move it off the screen completely if we want. 500 pixels, you might wonder why we might want to do that. It can actually be quite useful because we might want to slide it in some sort of fancy animation later on, which we'll see how to do in the jQuery chapter. But for now, the main thing is we can move it left and right by having positive or negative numbers there. We can also move it up and down by adding a top property. Again, you can think of this a bit like having a margin at the top. So if we have a 100 pixel margin there, that will move it 100 pixels down. And there we go. So let's just, in fact, we'll have it 100 pixels there. So it's now 100 pixels to the right and 100 pixels down of where it would otherwise be. So this is what this relative positioning is all about. We're positioning it relative to where it was. So quick challenge for you. Can you move the blue box so it's 100 pixels to the right and 100 pixels up of where it is now? 100 pixels to the right, 100 pixels up. Go for it. All right, hope you managed that. All we needed to do was set the position to relative again. And then 100 pixels right means left 100 pixels. And then for 100 pixels up, we're going to use a top of minus 100 pixels. If we used 100 pixels there, that would of course move it 100 pixels down. So let's just check. Wonderful. So it's now got 100 pixels right and 100 pixels up. And we can use this relative positioning on any element. It doesn't have to be a box, it doesn't have to be a div. We could do it on the paragraph or a table or an image or anything that we wanted to be moved around in some way. Great. So I'm going to show you a different type of positioning in a moment. But first, I just want to move this second section back and just show you how when you've got two elements overlapping like this, you might want to change which one appears in front of the other. So by default, the green box here is in front of the blue one, but if we wanted it to be the other way round, we could change that with a Z index. So Z index works in this way. We can set the Z index of any element we like, so whether it be a div or a paragraph or whatever, and then the one with the highest Z index will appear at the front. So if I give this one, let's say a Z index of 1, and this one a Z index of 2, the second one, i.e. the blue one, should appear in front of the green one. That won't quite work as it is though, because Z index require a position of relative, or there are a couple of other position types that will work, but we've only seen relative so far, so we'll stick with that to work. So let's have a look now. There we go. So now the blue one is in front of the green one. So Z indexes are really handy if you want to have overlapping elements and you want to be very clear as to which is going to be in the front. And you can set the Z index whatever you like. So you could have 100 different values if you had 100 different things overlapping each other, which I probably wouldn't recommend, but you could do it if you wanted. One other little cheeky thing I'm going to show you is really to do with positioning, but while we're talking about layering, it's quite nice. You might want to have an element in the front which is a little bit see-through, so you can actually see the element behind it, and that's pretty easy to achieve. So at the moment, second section is in the front. So if we set the opacity, which is how opaque the object is, an opacity of 1 means that it will be completely solid, as it is now. An opacity of 0 means that it will be completely invisible, and it's there but we can't see it. And an opacity of, say, 0.5 means that it will be there but see-through. So you can choose whatever opacity you like on a scale of 0 to 1, and the bigger the number, the less see-through it is. So that can be really nice, especially if you're working with images, have a sort of slightly faded image behind your text or something like that, however you wanted to do it. All right, so we've had a lot of fun with relative positioning. I'm now going to show you a couple of other types of positioning which can be really useful as well. So if we go back to our default with no positioning at all, I'm going to start with a position of absolute. So instead of relative, we're now talking absolute. And this is now quite different to how we were working before with relative positioning. And let's just see how that affects the page. Aha! The second section has now completely disappeared. Well, it hasn't actually disappeared. What's happened is it's gone behind the first section. So if we change the width of that one to 400, you can see it's actually still there, as is the paragraph underneath, but they're behind it. And that's because absolute positioning then takes the object that you're positioning out of the flow of the page. So basically all the other elements position themselves as if this green box isn't there at all. So that can be really useful if you want something to be on top of everything else and for everything else to ignore that. And here then the positioning is relative to the top left of the page. So we can do similar things that we did before. We could move it 500 pixels to the right, and we could move it, say, 200 pixels down. And that would move it around in exactly the same way as we had before. But the main point of absolute positioning is it takes the element out of the flow of the page. So if you want something to position itself over the top of everything else, that's the way to do it. All right, so that's absolute positioning. Take it back to there now. So the last one I want to show you is a position of fixed. Now, how could this be different to the others, you wonder? Well, let's find out. If we have a look at how that looks by itself, it's exactly the same as absolute. So fixed is out of the flow of the page, just like absolute, and we can move it around just like absolute. So how is it different to absolute? Well, we can see this very clearly. If, for example, I changed the height of my second section, which is the blue div here, and made it really big, so something like 5,000 pixels, then we've now got a really long page, and watch what happens if I start to scroll down. Here we go. The green box stays in position. So that's how fixed is different to absolute. Absolute will move when the page is scrolled, fixed will not. So a typical example for a fixed position div might be if you want to have a menu at the top of your page and you want that to appear even as the user scrolls down the page, then you might use a fixed position for that. And there we go. So there's several different types of positioning there. I'll give you a quick summary. Remember, relative positioning means we can move the element relative to where it would otherwise be in the page. Absolute positioning takes the element out of the flow of the page and allows us to move it around relative to the top left of the page. And fixed positioning does the same thing, but it keeps the element fixed even when we scroll down the page. And for all three of those types, we can use left and top to move it left and right and up and down to get it exactly where we want it. We also saw how to use opacity to change how see-through an object is, and Z-index to help make clear which object goes in front when you've got two overlapping ones. Great, so lots of new information there. As always, do have a play around and see what you can make happen with these different positions. We're going to move on to something slightly different, and that is margins.